225, Chapter 3 of Dracula. Welcome to CraftLit, the podcast for crafters who love books. My name is Heather Ordover, and I'm podcasting from the shores of the Potomac in Virginia, the Old Dominion. Episode 225, Banded. This episode of CraftLit is brought to you by Knit Circus, the online magazine featuring 3 rings of knitting, sewing, and fun. You can find out more by visiting www.knitcircus.com. Also, Tea Times Creations. You can find vintage china tea stands, fittings, and more. Visit Tea Times Creations at Etsy.com or follow the link in the show notes. And Cool for Cats, the new novel by Andrew C. Ordover. You can get it at Amazon.com or find out more from the link in the show notes. Greetings and salutations. No, I'm just kidding. Hi, I have been under a rock made of yarn for the last week. Since last I left you, I have been knitting and knitting and knitting, and then I was knitting. Oh, and did I mention I was knitting? And what I have come to as a conclusion is this. I am a ungodly slow knitter. What I was working on, actually, was the sweater for the final set for the Voyager Quayside Press, the knitting socks from around the world book that has the finished socks in them. Well, the scarf book is coming out soon, and that would have a finish scarf in it, and then that will be followed by a hat and mitten book, which will have a finish hat and mitten set in it. And the final step, as you might expect, is a finished sweater. And it took a while. It's very pretty. I'm very happy with it. In fact, it was the first time that I've ever seen my husband respond to a piece of knitting the way he responded to this particular piece of knitting, with that, wow, that is gorgeous. And he wasn't talking about me. No, but there was the ripping out, and there was the planning, and then there was the math, and then there was more knitting, and then there was more ripping out, and then there was more knitting, and then it was, my arms are really long, and then I had to make a decision. So do I knit it for me, or do I knit it for normal people? And the decision was that I knitted it for normal people. So probably someone named Dawn will be the recipient of this sweater when all is said and done. But it is gorgeous, and it is finished. And some of you may be wondering, especially if you're new to the podcast, why am I talking about this? And why am I so into finished stuff? And I'll tell you. My cousin married a lovely Finnish girl back in 2002. And his son is growing up. Their son is growing up speaking both Finnish and English. And so we went to Finland for the wedding. And I fell in love. Finland is stunning. I really needed to have a very thick eye shade because we were there in the summertime and I had a south-facing window, which meant it was light all the time. But it was beautiful. And I know that the winter would be very difficult. But I am here to tell you that the summer is glorious. And that's not even getting into, the food and the saunas and the jellies and the everything. Wow. I really, really liked Finland. And just in case you think such things aren't ever possible, I am here to tell you that when my mother and sister and I rode the train from Helsinki to, where did we have the wedding? Tampere. That's where we went, which, if you know Finland, you know that it's really bone-crushingly beautiful around there. We were out on the lake and we were everywhere. Anyway, the train from Helsinki to Tampere, which was not a particularly long train ride, was perhaps the cleanest piece of machinery I have ever been on. And it was 2 floors. It was a double-decker train. And we went upstairs so we could have a view. And the front of each train car, my sister and I checked this out. The front of each train car on the top was a children's play area that looked like IKEA had come in and set it up as a demo. It not only had a little wooden slide and playing blocks and some little, Lego-like toys. It had books. Yes, there were books. There were still books. They were still there. This had not been set up that morning. No one walked off with the books. So when I hooked up with Voyager Press and Quayside Publishing, and was lucky enough to be invited after shopping Madame Defarge around, was lucky enough to be invited to join in with the designers on this. They said, Norway's taken, and Denmark's taken, and Peru is taken, and all these other places around the world are taken. What would you like to do? And I said, ooh, Finland. And then I started doing research, and I don't read Finnish. I know very few words in Finnish. I think I can say hello, goodbye, and cheers. And I might be able to manage where's the bathroom. But Finland is fascinating. If you ever are lucky enough to have a chance to go, please, please, please do. Spend some of your money in the gorgeous country of Finland. And my sister and my mother were lucky enough. They had a little extra time. I had to get back to Thing 1, who was 1 year old at the time, or 2. He was almost 2. My mom and sister got to go to Estonia, and they said that was also worth a trip. As you probably know, if you have read anything about Estonian shawls and such like, that Estonia rocks. But, Finland, I'd go back in a heartbeat. That place is awesome. And my husband's been to Norway, and he said Norway was fantastic. And he was there in the wintertime. So that's not Westland-Dixie. That's saying something. Anyway, so I've been under a Finnish rock. It's a good rock. It's a soft rock. It's a very pretty rock. But my rock was made of yarn and Finland. One of the things my Finnish rock prevented me from doing this week was being more participatory in the knit-alongs, the Madame Defarge knit-alongs. Right now, the Wilhelmina Shawlette knit-along is happening on Ravelry at the WWMDFK, the What Would Madame Defarge Knit group. And I'm woefully behind. But I am actually, while I edit the podcast, I am knitting my little Wilhelmina Shawlette. So I'm struggling to catch up. But I'm also going to be lurking. I don't think I will be participating, but I will be lurking in the Van Tassel mitten knit-along. Now, I didn't make as big a deal about this because honestly, I forgot that October was happening so soon. Such is the plight of those of us who are not looking at a calendar every day, as in teaching. When I had to write the date on the board every day, I knew exactly what day it was all the time. Now that I don't have to do that, it's like, is it Friday? Is it Tuesday? I have no idea. So the Van Tassel mitten knit-along has started. However, if you have not started with it on time, quote unquote, don't hesitate. We will extend the end date a little bit, and Meg is happy to take you on and help you through the knitting of a stunning pair of Van Tassel mittens. And again, as with all of the patterns in Madame Defarge and all of the designers, there is leeway. So you don't have to have the exact same colors that Meg had. And you don't have to have exactly the same whatever. She is there to talk to. I know some people are making the Wilhelmina shawl bigger. Some people are doing it a different weight yarn. I am doing mine in a different weight yarn. And that's fine. That's the beauty of having the designer there. And I mean, our designers are not Alice Starmore. They are not going to get mad at you for substituting yarn. I promise. Plus, Chrissy and Meg are just awesome. So, it'll be fun. So the Van Tassel mitten knit-along is also happening at the WWMDFK group. And you are more than welcome to troop over there and join in. And if you aren't in a place where you can do a knit-along right now, or a second knit-along, or a mitten knit-along, or whatever, but you have questions, please go over there and ping Meg and let her know, and she will be more than happy to help you out. Last night, I fully expected that I would not be able to podcast this morning because somebody knocked our power out for 6 hours. So hurricane lamps and candles. I cooked dinner stovetop with hurricane lamps and candles. And you know what? Worst could happen. We had a really nice time. We had friends over too, which was hilarious. So the boys had no electronics. Oh, and they had to play games, and they had to... entertain each other and tell stories. And my husband set them up telling, one kid would say the first sentence, and then the next kid would say the next sentence, and the next kid would say the next sentence. And we listened to them telling stories, and they were hilarious, and they had the best time. And it has crossed my mind that perhaps every once in a while I should just go down to the basement and trip the circuit breaker and say, oh gosh, look at that. No electricity. Whatever will we do? I will cook on the stovetop. But it was lovely. So, husband's book, doing very well. It is on Goodreads as well as on Amazon. We are waiting for the Kindle version to come out any second. They keep saying any second. And my husband started a giveaway on Goodreads. And the numbers of people participating in the Goodreads giveaway are piling up. If you would like to be put into the running for a free book at goodreads.com. You can head on over there, sign yourself up if you aren't already signed up, and then look for either Cool for Cats or Andrew Ordover, and sign yourself up for the giveaway and see if you get it. And on the whole giveaway thing, if you donate to CraftLit during the month of October, you will be put into the running for a gorgeous vintage china stand from Tea Times Creations. You can check their stuff out over at Etsy.com, and also on the CraftLit show notes, you can see a picture of the china stand that is available to you should you donate to the podcast during the month of October. Banded. Why is the episode called Banded? It is called Banded because if you come to Rhinebeck, you will be able to get yourself a little wristband. You remember the WWJD wristbands? Well, we now have WWMDFK wristbands. What would Madame Defarge knit? On your wrist. Lovely wine-colored wristband. Which, I thought rather than blood red, I'd go with something kind of tasteful and a little muted. Because, after all, we're not children, are we? And if you buy a book at the Cooperative Press booth, you will get yourself a wristband. If you come and bring your book and have me sign it, and Dawn will also be at Rhinebeck. She's another one of our designers, and she will be over at Jenny the Potter's booth. So you can get both of us to sign it. You will get yourself a nifty little wristband. How cool is that? I'm very excited about that. So I am banded. I am here looking at my wristband and chortling to myself. Rhinebeck. I am both a player and a square in the Rhinebeck Bingo game. So please don't hesitate. Come up and say hello, and I will be, looking for people myself. I've been trying to figure out a good time for a meetup for CraftLit people, and here is my thinking. I am thinking meet me at the Cooperative Press booth at 11:30, and then we can all troop over to the Ravelry Party. I will not be able to stay at the Ravelry Party long because I will have to grab food and get back to the Cooperative Press booth, but this gives us a meetup time for both Saturday and Sunday, because there are Ravelry parties both days. So that way you have a time to come and pop in when I'll be there. And then I'll head over to the Ravelry Party with you and say hi to everyone. And the Cooperative Press booth is Building C, stall number 17. So C17. So, tattoo that on the inside of your eyelids, and then come and see me and say hi and get your little wristbandy thing and all that. And I am so looking forward to this. It's really nice to have something to look forward to. And this is something I am very much looking forward to. Ooh, and I did have one other little crafty thing that happened this last week. We had, here in the Washington, D.C. area, there was a craft fair called, I am not joking, I don't know if I'm going to have to put an explicit marker on the show now. It's called the Crafty Bastards Craft Fair. I couldn't believe it. It's actually on the bags. But we went, and I met, there were lots of wonderful people there. There was a guy who I will probably have on the show at some point. There was a guy who was taking the covers off of old cloth-bound books and making bracelets and journals and bookmarks and all sorts of cool things out of those. And I saw one that was Washington Irving So he took like Washington Irving off the spine of the book and made a bracelet out of it. And had the kids not been freezing, I would have stood in line to get one, but I couldn't. Couldn't do that to the kids. But the person that my kids found was the girl who has done the creepy crochet books. Remember all those the little soldiers and the little pirates and the little zombie brides and the little Cthulhu? Well, my kids picked her out of a crowd of hundreds of crafty people, and there she was. And she is the nicest person. She is just sweet and adorable and kind of shy. And she was there with all of her little crocheted goodies, and she made some awesome ray guns. They looked like Buck Rogers, the old-fashioned kind of 1930s serial ray guns. So cool, all in crochet. My boys were 100% ready to take her home with them. But I'm going to try and get her on the podcast later because I think she's really interesting and her creativity is really quite striking. Plus, anyone who's going to crochet a little Cthulhu or a zombie bride, I just love that. She's great. So that was very cool. And I hope to get them both on the podcast so you can find out some new things that people are doing out there in the crafty world. And things are starting to perk along with the trip to Tejas. Maybe I will show up in Texas soon. Since I have been under this rock of knitting, I have actually not been sitting in front of my computer at all since I podcasted last week. That's how long this has taken. I've popped in to grab a file here or print out a recipe there or delete a bunch of junk email over that way, but I have not actually spent any significant time sitting here, so I haven't answered emails, and I'm sorry about that. But I am not sorry about Dracula. The children of the night. I will be saying that for weeks now. You're all doomed. Doomed, I tell you. Dracula. Everybody's having such a good time about Dracula. People are even tweeting about how much fun they're having with Dracula, which is great. Because then your friends see your tweets and they tell two people, and they tell two people, and they tell two people. And, I think, what with CraftLit people just being better than everyone else, the more people we can tell about the books and the more people who come over and listen, the more people will be infected with your innate wonderfulness. And we will heal the world through literature and your being wonderful. And that is a good thing. No, I'm serious though. More and more people are coming over, which is just lovely. And this weekend, now that I am not under a Finnish rock of knitting, this weekend I will have the Just the Books parallel Dracula episodes up. So that will be available if you have friends who are really thinking, seriously, I have to listen to crafty stuff before I can hear about the book? What's up with that? So it'll be out there and ready for them this week. Dracula. So our fabulous reader, Jonathan, is continuing with our Jonathan Harker diary. Jonathan Harker's journal takes a turn for the, oh, dear Lord, that's terrifying in today's episode, as if last week wasn't bad enough, right? So last week it became clear that poor Jonathan Harker was stuck. And this week it's just that much more stuck-er that he gets. Last week, Dracula and Jonathan were kind of, I think I used the phrase kind of dancing around each other, doing this polite dance of the gentility and the deferring to someone who's royalty. And all of that continues to be true during this chapter, but we kind of amp it up a level in the tension and freakiness category. And a couple of things happen. One is we get, at the beginning of this chapter, we get a lovely little snapshot, this insight into how business was conducted in the late 1800s. And that's kind of fascinating. I think it's kind of fascinating to see, what did business guys do without faxes and telephones and any kind of immediate way to check on things. And you get kind of an answer to that question. You find out how people were able to protect their businesses and their transactions and their, for lack of a better way to say it, their business secrets, you know, things that you wouldn't necessarily want to have anybody else know everything you were doing in business. And so you do find out about that. But this is also the first chapter where we really get into one of the reasons why I think this book isn't a children's book. Now, I know there has been discussion on this, people saying, you know, I read it when I was 13, and I totally get that. I think where I'm going with this not being a children's book is that if you understand everything you're reading, it's not a children's book. Any more than if you understand everything that you're reading, Alice in Wonderland is not a children's book. There's, just like with great Warner Brothers cartoons of the 30s and 40s, there's the kid jokes, and then there's the grown-up jokes. Even a TV show as brilliant as Phineas and Ferb is doing the same thing, although there's no layer of sexuality over it like you would get with what's going to come in Dracula. But there's the jokes on Phineas and Ferb, which are kid jokes. And then there's these crazy references to the 60s, 70s, 80s, 90s politics. Just ridiculous things that make the adults crack up. And Pinky and the Brain used to do this. Animaniacs used to do this. It's difficult to pull off well. And if you haven't watched Phineas and Ferb, really see if you can find an episode somewhere, because you will crack up. Dracula is not Phineas and Ferb. Dracula is not a Warner Brothers cartoon. But Dracula has the plot, which I think is fairly simple to understand. And then there are layers of stuff happening on top of that and under that and around it and infused within it. And I think anyone, a 10-year-old, could read the book and get the plot. I actually think Bram Stoker's language, when it comes to pure plot points, if a kid can slog through the stuff that they don't understand, they could probably, at 10, read the book and get the plot, and that's fine. But this week is the first week that you start to get an inkling that it's more than just plot. And we've talked in other books and here with Dracula about Victorian repression and sexuality being kind of fraught. You know, it was fine for men to stray within a marriage, but it was grounds for divorce if a woman did. And if you've ever seen, let's see, what's some good reference material for you? An excellent one. Rupert Everett in the late 90s did a movie. He was in a movie with, oh gosh, I think Cate Blanchett was in it, and Jeremy Northam too. An Ideal Husband, Oscar Wilde's play, An Ideal Husband, was brought to the screen. Very, very nicely done. Oh, and I think Julianne Moore was in it too. I'm not sure about that. Anyway, excellent movie that really touches on all of the kind of sexual politics that were going on at the time. Shaw wrote a brilliant play, which I'm sure is never done anymore, called Mrs. Warren's Profession. You can imagine, with a title like that, what her profession might be. And so it's not that these things weren't being spoken about. It was that when they were spoken about, it had to be done cautiously and carefully. And certainly if you were going to imply that there was a double standard at work, you would have to be male. And you would probably have to be wealthy and reasonably powerful yourself, or you were going to get fairly heartily criticized. But as I said in the previous episode, when I read the comment from our Chicago knitter guy, there are, of course, lots of reasons aside from if you pull out the unfairness of the double standard of any double standard, of the inherent unfairness of anyone saying, do what I say, not what I do. If you remove that for a minute, it is very apparent that it is far more dangerous for a female to be in a sexual relationship with a man than it is for a man to be in a sexual relationship with a female, because the female can get pregnant. It's also a lot easier for disease to go hidden in a woman for a long time, up to the point where it's actually quite deadly, than it is for a man. The symptoms are often much more apparent in a man than in a woman. So, you know, just starting from the basic physical safety level, pregnancy and disease are two really unwanted pregnancy and disease are two really good reasons not to have sex outside of marriage. I think we can all agree with that. It's not an ethical judgment. It's not a value judgment. It's not a you're a bad person if you did. It's a wow, pregnancy that you didn't want is really a sticky wicket that you'd have to deal with. And when you're looking at a world where there really wasn't a whole lot of options when it came to birth control, you were up a creek. And of course, there were things that women could do, and there were things that you could drink, and there were doctors you could go to, but none of that was particularly safe. You know, truly the best option was don't get sick and don't get pregnant. And the only way to be sure of either of those two things would be not to have sex. So it's one of those things where you really have to put yourself into the mindset of the time and go back and look at the context and go back and think about medicine at the time for a moment. And then you start to see, well, this repression of women, if you're just looking at that very small cross-section of it, that was actually probably not such a bad idea. Now, where it becomes a problem, of course, is when it extends into things like birdcage corsets, corsets that are made out of metal, and removing women's lower ribs so that they look better in their corsets, and, you know, foot binding in China. You know, all of these things that did physical damage, well, that's taking that repression a step beyond health. That's actually causing problems with health. And so I'm not talking about that section of repression. I think everybody can agree that when you get to that level, you've crossed a line. You know, anything that denies someone access to a healthy life or an educated life or anything like that, I think we can agree would be a bad thing. And in fact, part of what I'm bringing to you today is colored a little bit by having watched. I only was able to watch the first episode while I was knitting, but Ken Burns has a new documentary out, and this one is on prohibition. And it was happening at this time, which is why it actually makes sense to bring it up with Dracula. In the United States during the 1890s and the turn of the century and into the 20s, there was this move towards prohibition. And I was always taught that prohibition was stupid. It was a very conservative movement. It was trying to legislate morality. It was done for dumb reasons, and it was an abject failure, and they had to repeal the amendment. And that's pretty much what I learned at school. And if you have an opportunity to watch Ken Burns' documentary, you will find, as I did, shockingly, but not surprisingly, that the actual reasons behind prohibition were solid and good and part of the progressive movement, and in large part done to protect women and children. But also, the breweries owned the saloons, and there were crazy places like, I think it was a city in Maine. A city in Maine had, I'm trying to remember the numbers. It was ridiculous. It was like, I don't know. I'm totally off base with this, but this gives you an idea. It was like out of 220 business establishments, 110 of them were having to do with liquor or sold liquor. It was something ridiculous like that. The United States had a problem with drinking. And strangely, some things don't seem to change. It caused real trouble because, of course, the men would get paid on Friday or Saturday, and then they would go on a bender that night and drink, and their wives are at home with the children, and they come home with no money, drunk. They beat their wives, they beat their kids, and then the wife has no way to buy food for the week. You can see how the anti-slavery movement, the votes for women movement, and the anti-drinking movement could all have very easily joined together, which they did for a time, and then they kind of branched off from each other. But this idea that freedom and license are not the same things. And while people say, well, it's a free country, I can have a drink if I want to, sure. But once your right to drink infringes upon your family's right to survive, you've crossed a line into kind of license and debauchery, and that's not helping anyone. And so you can start to see how once you get on that slippery slope, things get far more complicated. Just like when it comes to women and sexuality in the Victorian and the late Victorian era, and into the Edwardian era as well. It's just, I just want to make sure that I am making it very clear that sexual repression at this time is more complicated than, oh, they treated women badly. And the reason why I bring all this up is because this is our first voluptuous chapter. And I say that with a smile on my face because Bram Stoker has a word that he loves the same way Nathaniel Hawthorne loved his word. Do we remember? Ignominious. Well, Bram Stoker's word is voluptuous, and you will get sick of hearing it. I did. But I think it's a good word, actually. I mean, there's a reason why he keeps bringing it up. And there aren't that many other words that really convey voluptuous other than voluptuous. And so I went and I looked up voluptuous. And it's interesting. It's full of delight or pleasure to the senses, suggesting sexual pleasure by fullness and beauty of form, given to or spent in enjoyment of luxury, pleasure, or gratification. A voluptuous holiday would be fine. The voluptuous richness of the music. So it doesn't have to be sexual, but I think it is. And synonyms in the particular dictionary I was looking at have carnal, fleshy, luscious, lush, sensuous, and sensual. And those are simply words that I think they vary too far from where he's actually going. Maybe sensuous and sensual, maybe. But I actually think voluptuous is really the word he's going after. Now, it comes from Middle English with a Latin base, and that comes from the Latin irregular form of a word meaning pleasure or pleasurable. It also seems to be related to a Greek word for hope and a Latin word for to wish, which I thought was very interesting. And I think it does kind of tie up in it this the pleasure side of things and the kind of the ripe, overripe side of things, but it also there's a yearning in there, which you're going to see in today's episode. Now, there's probably at least one moment in today's chapter where you are going to get mad at Jonathan Harker. Let it go. Let it go, because the rest of the book won't happen if you don't get mad at Jonathan, or if he doesn't do something that might make you angry at him. You're going to find out a little bit more about Dracula. Useful information that does, in fact, come back later and is worth, filing in the back of your memory. It's not something you need to pay really close attention to when he talks about his history, but it is important enough. Bram Stoker isn't just filling idle pages. And And that's it. I'll talk to you on the flip side. I hope you enjoy today's chapter, which is Chapter 3 of Dracula.
Chapter 3. Jonathan Harker's Journal. When I found that I was a prisoner, a sort of wild feeling came over me. I rushed up and down the stairs, trying every door and peering out of every window I could find, but after a little the conviction of my helplessness overpowered all other things. When I look back after a few hours, I think I must have been mad for the time, for I behaved much as a rat does in a trap. When, however, the conviction had come to me that I was helpless, I sat down quietly as I have ever done anything in my life, and began to think over what was best to be done. I am thinking still, and as yet have come to no definite conclusion. Of one thing only I am certain, that it is no use making my ideas known to the Count. He knows well that I am imprisoned, and as he has done it himself, and has doubtless his own motives for it, he would only deceive me if I trusted him fully with the facts. So far as I can see, my only plan will be to keep my knowledge and my fears to myself and my eyes open. I am, I know, either being deceived like a baby by my own fears, or else I am in desperate straits, and if the latter be so, I need, and shall need, all my brains to get through. I had hardly come to this conclusion when I heard the great door below shut, and knew that the Count had returned. He did not come at once into the library, so I went cautiously to my own room and found him making the bed. This was odd, but only confirmed what I had all along thought, that there were no servants in the house. When later I saw him through the chink of the hinges of the door laying the table in the dining room, I was assured of it, for if he does himself all these menial offices, surely it is proof that there is no one else to do them. This gave me a fright, for if there is no one else in the castle, it must have been the Count himself who was the driver of the coach that brought me here. This is a terrible thought, for if so, what does it mean that he could control the wolves, as he did, by only holding up his hand in silence? How was it that all the people at B Streets and on the coach had some terrible fear for me? What meant the giving of the crucifix, of the garlic, of the wild rose, of the mountain ash? Bless that good woman who hung the crucifix round my neck, for it is a comfort and a strength to me whenever I touch it. It is odd that a thing which I have been taught to regard with disfavour and as idolatrous should in time of loneliness and trouble be of help. Is it that there is something in the essence of the thing itself, or that it is a medium, a tangible help in the conveying memories of sympathy and comfort? Some time, if it may be, I must examine this matter and try to make up my mind about it. In the meantime, I must find out all I can about Count Dracula, as it may help me to understand. Tonight he may talk of himself, if I turn the conversation that way. I must be very careful, however, not to awake his suspicion. Midnight. I have had a long talk with the Count. I asked him a few questions on Transylvanian history, and he warmed up to the subject wonderfully. In his speaking of things and people, and especially of battles, he spoke as if he had been present at them all. This he explained afterwards by explaining that to a boyar the pride of his house and name is his own pride, and that their glory is his glory, that their fate is his fate. Whenever he spoke of his house he always said we, and spoke almost in the plural, like a king speaking. I wish I could put down all he said exactly as he said it, for to me it was most fascinating. It seemed to have in it a whole history of the country. He grew excited as he spoke, and walked about the room pulling his great white moustache and grasping anything on which he laid his hands, as though he would crush it by main strength. One thing he said which I shall put down as nearly as I can, for it tells in its way the story of his race. We Zelkalis have a right to be proud, for in our veins flows the blood of many brave races who fought as the lion fights for lordship. Here in the whirlpool of European races, the Ugric tribe bore down from Iceland the fighting spirit which Thor and Woden give them, which their berserkers displayed to such fell intent on the seaboards of Europe, aye, and of Asia and Africa too, till the peoples thought that the werewolves themselves had come. Here too, when they came, they found the Huns, whose warlike fury had swept the earth like a living flame, till the dying peoples held that in their veins ran the blood of these old witches, who, expelled from Scythia, had mated with the devils in the desert. Fools! Fools! What devil or what witch was ever so great as Attila, whose blood is in these veins? He held up his arms. Is it a wonder that we were a conquering race? That we were proud? That when the Magyar, the Lombard, the Avar, the Bulgar, or the Turk poured his thousands on our frontiers, we drove them back? Is it strange that when Arpad and his legions swept through the Hungarian fatherland, he found us here when he reached the frontier? That the Honfoglalas was completed there? And when the Hungarian flood swept eastward, the Zelkalis were claimed as kindred by the victorious Magyars, and to us for centuries were trusted the guardian of the frontier of Turkey land. Aye, and more than that, endless duty of the frontier guard, for, as the Turks say, water sleeps, and enemy is sleepless. Who more gladly than we, throughout the 4 nations, received the bloody sword, or at its warlike call flocked quicker to the standard of the king? When was it redeemed at the great shame of my nation, the shame of Kosovo, when the flags of the Wallach and the Magyar went down beneath the crescent? Who was it but one of my own race who as voivode crossed the Danube and beat the Turk on his own ground? This was a Dracula indeed. Who was it that his own unworthy brother, when he had fallen, sold his people to the Turk and brought the shame of slavery on them? Was it not this Dracula indeed who inspired that other of his race, who in a later age again and again brought his forces over the great river into Turkey land? Who, when he was beaten back, came again and again and again, though he had to come alone from the bloody field where his troops were being slaughtered, since he knew that he alone could ultimately triumph? They said that he thought only of himself. Bah! What good are peasants without a leader? Where ends the war without a brain and a heart to conduct it? Again, when, after the Battle of Mohacs, we threw off the Hungarian yoke, we of the Dracula blood were amongst their leaders, for our spirit would not brook that we were not free. Ah, young sir, the Zelkalis, and their Dracula as their heart's blood, their brains and their swords, can boast a record that mushroom growths like the Habsburgs and the Romanovs can never reach. The warlike days are over. Blood is too precious a thing in these days of dishonorable peace, and the glories of the great races are as a tale that is told. It was by this time close to morning, and we went to bed. Memo. This diary seems horribly like the beginning of the Arabian Nights, for everything has to break off at cockcrow, or like the ghost of Hamlet's father. 12th of May. Let me begin with facts. Bare, meagre facts, verified by books and figures, and of which there can be no doubt. I must not confuse them with experiences which will have to rest on my own observation or my memory of them. Last evening, when the Count came from his room, he began asking me questions on legal matters, and on the doing of certain kinds of business. I had spent the day wearily over books, and, simply to keep my mind occupied, went over some of the matters I had been examined in at Lincoln's Inn. There was a certain method in the Count's inquiries, so I shall try and put them down in sequence. The knowledge may somehow or sometime be useful to me. First, he asked if a man in England might have 2 solicitors or more. I told him he might have a dozen if he wished, but that it would not be wise to have more than one solicitor engaged in one transaction, as only one could act at a time, and that to change would be certain to mitigate against his interests. He seemed thoroughly to understand, and went on to ask if there would be any practical difficulty in having one man to attend, say, to banking, and another to look after shipping in case local help were needed in a place far from the home of the banking solicitor. I asked him to explain more fully, so that I might not by any chance mislead him. So he said, "I shall illustrate. Your friend and mine, Mr. Peter Hawkins, from under the shadow of your beautiful cathedral at Exeter, which is far from London, buys for me through your good self my place in London. Good. Now here let me say frankly, lest you should think it strange that I have sought the services of one so far off from London, instead of some resident there, that my motive was that no local interest may be served save my wish only. And as one of London resident might, perhaps, have some purpose of himself or friend to serve, I went thus afield to seek my agent, whose labours should only be to my interest. Now suppose I, who have much of affairs, wish to ship goods, say, to Newcastle, or Durham, or Harwich, or Dover, might it not be that it could with more ease be done by consigning to one of these ports? I answered that certainly it would be most easy, but that we solicitors had a system of agency one for the other, so that local work could be done locally on instruction from any solicitor, so that the client, simply placing himself in the hands of one man, could have his wishes carried out by him without further trouble. But, said he, I could be at liberty to direct myself, is it not so? Of course, I replied, and such is often done by men of business who do not like the whole of their affairs to be known by any one person. Good, he said, and then went on to ask about the means of making consignments and the forms to be gone through, and of all sorts of difficulties which might arise, but by forethought could be guarded against. I explained all these things to him to the best of my ability, and he certainly left me under the impression that he would have made a wonderful solicitor, for there was nothing he did not think of or foresee. For a man who was never in the country, and who did not evidently do much in the way of business, his knowledge and acumen were wonderful. When he had satisfied himself on these points of which he had spoken, and I had verified all as well as I could by the books available, he suddenly stood up and said, Have you written since your first letter to our friend Mr. Peter Hawkins, or to any other? It was with some bitterness in my heart that I answered that I had not, that as yet I had not seen any opportunity of sending letters to anybody. Then write now, my young friend, he said, laying a heavy hand on my shoulder. Write to our friend and to any other, and say, if it would please you, that you shall stay with me until a month from now. Do you wish me to stay so long? I asked, for my heart grew cold at the thought. I desire it much. Nay, I will take no refusal. When your master, employer, what you will, engaged that someone should come on his behalf, it was understood that my needs only were to be consulted. I have not stinted, is it not so? What could I do but bow acceptance? It was Mr. Hawkins' interest, not mine, and I had to think of him, not myself. And besides, while Count Dracula was speaking, there was that in his eyes and in his bearing which made me remember that I was a prisoner, and that if I wished it I could have no choice. The Count saw his victory in my bow, and his mastery in the trouble of my face, for he began at once to use them, but in his own smooth, resistless way. I pray you, my good young friend, that you will not discourse of things other than business in your letters. It will doubtless please your friends to know that you are well, and that you look forward to getting home to them, is it not so? As he spoke, he handed me 3 sheets of notepaper and 3 envelopes. They were all of the thinnest foreign post, and looking at them, then at him, and noticing his quiet smile, with the sharp canine teeth lying over the red underlip, I understand as well as if he had spoken that I should be careful what I wrote, for he would be able to read it. So I determined to write only formal notes now, but to write fully to Mr. Hawkins in secret, and also to Mina, for to her I could write in shorthand, which would puzzle the Count if he did see it. When I had written my 2 letters, I sat quiet, reading a book, whilst the Count wrote several notes referring as he wrote them to some books on his table. Then he took up my 2 and placed them with his own, and put by his writing materials, after which, the instant the door had closed behind him, I leaned over and looked at the letters which were face down on the table. I felt no compunction in doing so, for under the circumstances I felt that I should protect myself in every way I could. One of the letters was directed to Samuel F. Billington, No. 7, The Crescent, Whitby, and another to Herr Lautner, Varna. The third was to Coutts & Co., London, and the fourth to Heron Klopstock and Bill Ruth, bankers, Budapest. The second and fourth were unsealed. I was just about to look at them when I saw the door handle move. I sank back in my seat, having just had time to replace the letters as they had been, and to resume my book before the Count, holding still another letter in his hand, entered the room. He took up the letters on the table and stamped them carefully, and then, turning to me, said, I trust you will forgive me, but I have much work to do in private this evening. You will, I hope, find all things as you wish. At the door he turned, and after a moment's pause said, Let me advise you, my dear young friend, nay, let me warn you with all seriousness, that should you leave these rooms, you will not by any chance go to sleep in any other part of the castle. It is old and has many memories, and there are bad dreams for those who sleep unwisely. Be warned. Should sleep now or ever overcome you, or be like to do, then haste to your own chamber or to these rooms, for your rest will then be safe. But if you are not careful in this respect, then... He finished his speech in a gruesome way, for he motioned with his hands as if he were washing them. I quite understood. My only doubt was as to whether any dream could be more terrible than the unnatural, horrible net of gloom and mystery which seemed closing around me. Later. I endorsed the last words written, but this time there was no doubt in question. I shall not fear to sleep in any place where he is not. I have placed the crucifix over the head of my bed. I imagine that my rest is thus freer from dreams, and there it shall remain. When he left me, I went to my room. After a little while, not hearing any sound, I came out and went up the stone stair to where I could look out towards the south. There was some sense of freedom in the vast expanse, inaccessible though it was to me, as compared with the narrow darkness of the courtyard. Looking out on this, I felt I was indeed in prison, and I seemed to want a breath of fresh air, though it were of the night. I am beginning to feel this nocturnal existence tell on me. It is destroying my nerve. I start at my own shadow, and am full of all sorts of horrible imaginings. God knows that there is ground for any terrible fear in this accursed place. I looked out over the beautiful expanse, bathed in soft yellow moonlight, till it was almost as light as day. In the soft light the distant hills became melted, and the shadows in the valleys and gorges of velvety blackness. The mere beauty seemed to cheer me. There was peace and comfort in every breath I drew. As I leaned from the window, my eye was caught by something moving a story below me, and somewhat to my left, where I imagined from the lie of the rooms that the windows of the Count's own room would look out. The window at which I stood was tall and deep, stone-mullioned, and though weather-worn, was still complete, but it was evidently many a day since the case had been there. I drew back behind the stonework and looked carefully out. What I saw was the Count's head coming out from the window. I did not see the face, but I knew the man by the neck and movements of his back and arms. In any case, I could not mistake the hands which I had had so many opportunities of studying. I was at first interested and somewhat amused, for it is wonderful how small a matter will interest and amuse a man when he is a prisoner. But my feelings changed to repulsion and terror when I saw the whole man slowly emerge from the window and began to crawl down the castle wall over that dreadful abyss, face down with his cloak spreading out around him like great wings. At first I could not believe my eyes. I thought it was some trick of the moonlight, some weird effect of shadow, but I kept looking, and it could be no delusion. I saw the fingers and toes grasp the corners of the stones, worn clear of the mortar by the stress of years, and by thus using every projection and inequality move downwards with considerable speed, just as a lizard moves along a wall. What manner of man is this? Or what manner of creature is it in the semblance of man? I feel the dread of this horrible place overpowering me. I am in fear, in awful fear, and there is no escape for me. I am encompassed about with terrors that I dare not think of. 15th of May. Once more have I seen the Count go out in his lizard fashion. He moves downwards in a sidelong way, some 100 feet down and a good deal to the left. He vanished into some hole or window. When his head had disappeared, I leaned out to try and see more, but without avail. The distance was too great to allow a proper angle of sight. I knew that he had left the castle now, and thought to use the opportunity to explore more that I had dared to do as yet. I went back to the room, and taking a lamp, tried all the doors. They were all locked as I had expected, and the locks were comparatively new, but I went down the stone stairs to the hall where I had entered originally. I found I could pull back the bolts easily enough and unhook the great chains, but the door was locked and the key was gone. The key must be in the Count's room. I must watch should this door be unlocked so that I may get it and escape. I went on to make a thorough examination of the various stairs and passages, and to try the doors that opened from them. 1 or 2 small rooms near the hall were open, but there was nothing to see in them except old furniture, dusty with age and moth-eaten. At last, however, I found one door at the top of a stairway which, though it seemed to be locked, gave a little under pressure. I tried it harder and found that it was not really locked, but that the resistance came from the fact that the hinges had fallen somewhat, and that the heavy door rested on the floor. Here was an opportunity which I might not have again, so I exerted myself, and with many efforts forced it back so that I could enter. I was now in a wing of the castle further to the right than the rooms I knew in a story lower down. From the windows I could see that the suite of rooms lay along to the south of the castle, the windows of the end room looking out both west and south. On the latter side, as well as to the former, there was a great precipice. The castle was built on the corner of a great rock, so that on 3 sides it was quite impregnable, and great windows were placed here where sling or bow or culverin could not reach, and consequently light and comfort impossible to a position which had to be guarded were secured. To the west was a great valley, and then, rising far away, great jagged mountain fastnesses, rising peak on peak, the sheer rock studded with mountain ash and thorn, whose roots clung in cracks and crevices and crannies of the stone. This was evidently the portion of the castle occupied in bygone days, for the furniture had more air of comfort than any I had seen. The windows were curtainless, and the yellow moonlight, flooding in through the diamond panes, enabled one to see even colours, whilst it softened the wealth of dust which lay over all and disguised in some measure the ravages of time and the moth. My lamp seemed to be of little effect in the brilliant moonlight, but I was glad to have it with me, for there was a dread loneliness in the place which chilled my heart and made my nerves tremble. Still, it was better than living alone in the rooms which I had come to hate from the presence of the Count, and after trying a little to school my nerves, I found a soft quietude come over me. Here I am, sitting at a little oak table where in old times possibly some fair lady sat to pen, with much thought and many blushes, her ill-spelt love letter, and writing in my diary in shorthand all that has happened since I closed it last. It is 19th century up to date with a vengeance, and yet, unless my senses deceive me, the old centuries had, and have, powers of their own which mere modernity cannot kill. Later, the morning of the 16th of May. God preserve my sanity, for to this I am reduced. Safety and the assurance of safety are things of the past. Whilst I live on here there is but one thing to hope for, that I may not go mad, if, indeed, I be not mad already. If I be sane, then surely it is maddening to think that of all the foul things that lurk in this hateful place, the Count is the least dreadful to me, that to him alone I can look for safety, even though this be only whilst I can serve his purpose. Great God, merciful God, let me be calm, for out of that way lies madness indeed. I begin to get new lights on certain things which have puzzled me. Up to now I never quite knew what Shakespeare meant when he made Hamlet say, "My tablets, quick, my tablets, 'tis meet that I put it down," etc. For now, feeling as though my own brain were unhinged, or as if the shock had come which must end in its undoing, I turned to my diary for repose. The habit of entering accurately must help to soothe me. The Count's mysterious warning frightened me at the time. It frightens me more now when I think of it, for in future he has a fearful hold upon me. I shall fear to doubt what he may say. When I had written in my diary and had fortunately replaced my book and pen in my pocket, I felt sleepy. The Count's warning came into my mind, but I took pleasure in disobeying it. The sense of sleep was upon me, and with it the obstinacy which sleep brings as outrider. The soft moon soothed, and the wide expanse without gave a sense of freedom which refreshed me. I determined not to return tonight to the gloom-haunted rooms, but to sleep here, where of old ladies had sat and sung and lived sweet lives, whilst their gentle breasts were sad for their menfolk away in the midst of remorseless wars. I drew a great couch out of its place near the corner, so that, as I lay, I could look at the lovely view to the east and south, and unthinking of and uncaring for the dust, composed myself for sleep. I suppose I must have fallen asleep. I hope so, but I fear, for all that followed was startlingly real. So real that now, sitting here in this broad, full sunlight of the morning, I cannot in the least believe that it was all sleep. I was not alone. The room was the same, unchanged in any way since I came into it. I could see along the floor, In the brilliant moonlight, my own footsteps marked where I had disturbed the long accumulation of dust. In the moonlight opposite me were 3 young women, ladies by their dress and manner. I thought at the time I must be dreaming when I saw them, for, though the moonlight was behind them, they threw no shadow on the floor. They came close to me and looked at me for some time and then whispered together. 2 were dark and had high aquiline noses like the Count, and great dark piercing eyes that seemed to be almost red when contrasted with the pale yellow moon. The other was fair as can be, with great wavy masses of golden hair and eyes like pale sapphires. I seemed somehow to know her face, and to know it in connection with some dreamy fear, but I could not recollect at the time how or where. All 3 had brilliant white teeth that shone like pearls against the ruby of their voluptuous lips. There was something about them that made me uneasy, some longing and at the same time some deadly fear. I felt in my heart a wicked, burning desire that they would kiss me with those red lips. It is not good to note this down, lest some day it should meet Mina's eyes and cause her pain, but it is the truth. They whispered together, and then they all 3 laughed. Such a silvery, musical laugh, but as hard as though the sound could never have come through the softness of human lips. It was like the intolerable tingling sweetness of water glasses when played on by a cunning hand. The fair girl shook her head coquettishly, and the other 2 urged her on. One said, "Go on. You are the first, and we shall follow. Yours is the right to begin." The other added, "He is strong and young. There are kisses for us all." I lay quiet, looking out under my eyelashes in an agony of delightful anticipation. The fair girl advanced and bent over me till I could feel the movements of her breath upon me. Sweet it was in one sense, honey-sweet, and sent the same tingling through the nerves as her voice, but with a bitter underlying, the sweet, bitter offensiveness, as one smells in blood. I was afraid to raise my eyelids, but looked out and saw perfectly under the lashes. The fair girl went on her knees and bent over me, fairly gloating. There was a deliberate voluptuousness which was both thrilling and repulsive, and as she arched her neck she actually lipped her lips like an animal, till I could see in the moonlight the moisture shining on the scarlet lips, and on the red tongue as it lapped the white sharp teeth. Lower and lower went her head as the lips went down the range of my mouth and chin and seemed about to fasten on my throat. Then she paused, and I could hear the churning sound of her tongue as it licked her teeth and lips, and could feel the hot breath on my neck. Then the skin of my throat began to tingle as one's flesh does when the hand that is to tickle it approaches nearer, nearer. I could feel the soft, shivering touch of the lips on the supersensitive skin of my throat, and the hard dents of 2 sharp teeth just touching and pausing there. I closed my eyes in a languorous ecstasy and waited with beating heart. But at that instant another sensation swept through me as quick as lightning. I was conscious of the presence of the Count and of his being as if lapped in a storm of fury. As my eyes opened involuntarily, I saw a strong hand grasp the slender neck of the fair woman and with giant's power drew it back. The blue eyes transformed with fury, the white teeth champing with rage, and the fair cheeks blazing red with passion. But the Count... Never did I imagine such wrath and fury even in the demons of the pit. His eyes were positively blazing. The red light in them was lurid, as if the flames of hellfire blazed behind him. His face was deathly pale, and the lines of it were hard like drawn wires. The thick eyebrows that met over the nose now seemed like a heaving bar of white-hot metal. With a fierce sweep of his arm he hurled the women from him, and then motioned to the others as though he were beating them back. It was the same imperious gesture that I had seen used to the wolves. In a voice which, though low and almost a whisper, seemed to cut through the air and then ring around the room, he exclaimed, "How dare you touch him, any of you? How dare you cast eyes on him when I had forbidden it? Back, I tell you all. This man belongs to me. Beware how you meddle with him, or you'll have to deal with me." The fair girl, with a laugh of ribald coquetry, turned to answer him. "You yourself never loved. You never love." On this the other women joined, and with such a mirthless, hard, soulless laughter rang through the room that it almost made me faint to hear. It seemed like the pleasure of fiends. The Count turned after looking at my face attentively and said in a soft whisper, "Yes, I too can love. You yourselves can tell it from the past. Is it not so? Well, now I promise you that when I am done with him, you shall kiss him at your will. Now go, go! I must awaken him, for there is work to be done." "Are we to have nothing tonight?" said one of them, with a low laugh, as she pointed to the bag which he had thrown upon the floor, and which moved as though there were some living thing within it. For answer he nodded his head. One of the women jumped forward and opened it. If my ears did not deceive me, there was a gasp and a low wail, as if of a half-smothered child. The women closed around, whilst I was aghast with horror, but as I looked they disappeared, and with them the dreadful bag. There was no door near them, and they could not have passed me without my noticing. They simply seemed to fade into the rays of the moonlight and pass through the window, for I could see outside the dim, shadowy forms for a moment before they entirely faded away. Then the horror overcame me, and I sank down unconscious. End of chapter 3.
Poor Jonathan. So, a little bit more has been revealed to us about Dracula from the comment from the woman, "You never loved, you never love." And he comes back and says, "Can't you tell? Of course I love." And we don't know if he's talking about Jonathan or something else, but we will find out, I promise. He is a fascinating character, and the women are interesting. There's 3 of them, for one thing, 3 being a magic number, but 3 also being, the way things seem to happen. Celebrity deaths, jokes come in 3s, the Trinity. So here we have kind of an unholy Trinity. There's lots of stuff that Stoker draws on throughout the book. And I think one of the reasons why the book has resonated for so long, so well for so long, is because he pulls on a lot of archetypal stuff, but he also manages to blend that kind of age-old, superstitious, don't go into the forest alone stuff with a modern voice and, to some extent, sensibility. Even enough modern for us today to get it. And I think in some ways there is a part of me that wishes that movie special effects were not as good now as they are, because of course it's very easy for us to imagine, or even to go to a film and see someone climbing down the face of a stone castle wall, gripping the stones with their fingertips and their toes, which is kind of creepy, with, face down with the cape billowing behind them. Everything is topsy-turvy. Everything is upside down. Everything is wrong at that point. Physics have stopped working when it comes to Dracula. And for us, I think we can be pretty blasé about it and go, well, I've seen weirder things in Harry Potter. But if you allow yourself to see that moment for Jonathan from the point of view of a Victorian man who's, wrapped his brain around the idea of a telegraph, and, the cinematoscope things were out and about, and what were those little things called? The little spinny things. I can't remember. The little calliopes. Not Odeons. Oh, it'll come to me at 3 a.m. There were little magic lantern shows, but there wasn't anything in Jonathan's life that could have prepared him for that moment. And it's not a dream. and he knows it's not a dream. It's kind of like on 9/11 when the kids and I were talking later, that all of us had the moment when we saw the wall of ash coming at us. We all had this moment where he went, oh my God, we're in the middle of a Jerry Bruckheimer film. And it's kind of your only point of reference, but it also gives you some sense of clarity and sanity in the middle of an otherwise insane situation to find yourself in the middle of. Someone who is untrained in combat, who has never seen a disaster of, any bigger than a crack in the wall after an earthquake, up close and personal. And I have a feeling for people who've been in the middle of hurricanes and tornadoes, there's that same moment of your brain struggles and strains to find something that matches, something that lets you grasp the enormity of what is happening to you. I think the first time a woman goes through childbirth, or her husband, if she's lucky enough to have a partner or a birthing coach with her who's never gone through it before either, that moment of birth is that same kind of thing. It's like you're grasping for, holy cow, look at what's happening. This is stupendous. This is shocking. This is enormous. This is radical and revolutionary. Well, Jonathan doesn't have anything remotely like that. And I think in a situation like that, you hang on as best you can to whatever lets you get through the day. But at some point, if you're constantly battered by these kinds of things that you have no reference point for, it starts to unhinge you. And we're going to start to see a little bit of that happen. But as we proceed through the narrative, and there's more and more of this kind of exposure to things that people have no reference point for, no kind of pin to hold it all together, I think you'll be very impressed at the characters that Bram Stoker has created. I mean, so far you've really only met two. You know that Harker is engaged to Mina. He's writing the diary, at least in part for Mina. And I give him a lot of credit for his honesty. Now, I know it's a plot device, and I know that Stoker had to have Jonathan explain the scene with the women to us. But in order to sell us the rest of the book, in order to create believable characters, we now know that Mina has to be the kind of woman who could handle reading Jonathan's diary, because he seems quite certain that at some point he will be sharing this with her. And if he does, she's now going to know that he was lying there, just waiting for this woman to come and have at him. Sexually. He didn't know there were teeth involved beforehand. But that languorous stupor that these vampires put their victims into, it is at once both sexual and also animal in that kind of, praying mantis sort of animal way. The lulling your victim into a sense of security before snapping their neck. It brings up all sorts of interesting stuff that we will get into more and more as the book progresses, because we'll have more and more opportunities to deal with all of this kind of stuff and archetype and things. Oh, and on that lulling your victims into submission thing, it also reminds me, I don't know if you heard it, but recently I was listening to the radio. There was some study that was done recently on sugar and salt, but sugar and children, and how children can, nothing is ever too sweet for a small child. They did this test where they were giving kids tastes of things, and they never hit a point at which a child would say, oh, that's too sugary, or that's too sweet. And so they started doing tests to figure out, what is it about a child's brain that allows them that? Because as you age, the desire for, the need for, the enjoyment from the sweet is overtaken with salt. And so that's why I think a lot of us find as we age that we will start going to bitter chocolate or dark chocolate, or having a bite of cake but leaving the frosting behind, whereas I was the one who would eat all the frosting off of everyone's plate after a birthday party with my family, because I was a kid and I loved sugar. Well, it turns out there is a reason. It turns out that sugar to small children, especially infants, but small children, like, 2, 3, younger, sugar acts as an analgesic. So when moils give babies sugar water or put sugar water on their gums before a circumcision, there's a reason for that, because it actually helps stop the pain receptors in their brain from working. And when my older son was very small, he had, we thought it was colic, and it turned out it was acid reflux. And the babysitter that we had, once I started back to teaching, she was Jamaican, and she was incredibly wise. I learned more from her than anyone. We're still in touch. She's going to come to his bar mitzvah, come hell or high water. We're going to make sure she's there. But she kept telling me she had to give him sugar water. And of course, I kept saying, that's crazy. Why would you do that? And finally, you're so desperate for anything to make your kid feel better. So fine, sugar water. There it is. That was the solution. The pain went away. So this vampire thing is almost like the adult version of the sugar water. The sweetness of their laugh, sort of, their beauty, the anticipation of the lips on the neck, that kind of sweet waiting, that pause. It's all kind of an analgesic for when they bite you. And that's so creepy. And I think very interesting that the first person who's put into this peril, put into this situation, put into this sexual situation, is a man. And I think it's important for a couple more reasons that we'll talk about later. And with that, I leave you. I will get one more podcast out before I head to Rhinebeck. So while I am on a train traveling up to New York, you will be able to listen to Chapter 4 of Dracula next week. I hope you have a great week. I'm changing some things with the iPhone iTouch Droid app. I'm changing the extras a little bit. I hope that's okay. Lots of interesting tidbits in the show notes. And don't forget, if you donate to the show this month, you get put into the running for a gorgeous vintage China tea stand from Tea Times Creations. Don't forget, we also have the 2 knit-alongs happening on Ravelry in the What Would Madame Defarge knit group, WWMDFK. And with that, I leave you to your own thoughts about Dracula. Have at it on the Ravelry site and in the comments. And I'll talk to you next week. Bye. Please remember to support the people who support CraftLit. Visit Knit Circus online magazine, offering 3 rings of knitting, sewing, and fun. You can check out the latest issue at www.knitcircus.com. And What Would Madame Defarge Knit? A new book of knit and crochet patterns coming to you from the CraftLit family. And please visit the blogs and sites of CraftLit supporters. Those links can be found in the sidebar of the show notes. The show notes can be found at craftlit.com. CraftLit can also be accessed by its own Android and iPhone application. You can purchase it at the iPhone or iTouch application store, or you can subscribe free at iTunes. CraftLit is made possible by the generous support of its listeners, and for that, I am truly grateful. And remember, if your hands are too busy to pick up a book, at least you can